The garden had been empty for a long time. Once it was a place of order, rows of beans, neat squares of carrots, a narrow path of stones that led from the gate to the shed. But now it was just soil and silence, half swallowed by weeds. The air carried the heavy scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The wall that bordered it was old stone, patched with mortar and moss. Near the corner, beneath a leaning lilac bush, the ground was softer than it should have been. That's where the rabbit began to dig. Her fur was patchy, dull from winter, and her belly thin from a season too long and too cold. But her paws were sure. She'd dug before, fields, roots, roadside banks, and she knew what kind of earth would give way easily. Each clawful came with the smell of damp and memory. Worms, roots, stones that had once been part of something built by people. The air shifted. A low rumble echoed somewhere far off. The rain was coming closer. She paused, nose twitching. The garden smelled of rot and newness at the same time. Wet leaves, broken stems, the faint sweetness of lilac above her head. It wasn't a bad smell. It was the kind of scent that meant the world was about to change. She dug deeper. The first drops of rain came soon after, fat and slow, hitting the dry leaves with a soft percussion. By the time her tunnel reached the other side of the wall, the sky had turned the color of slate, and the air had thickened into water. She slipped through, her fur brushing the wet stone. On the far side was the garden proper, the human side. It still held traces of care, even after years of neglect. A half-buried rake, a cracked ceramic pot, the faded outline of a fence gate. The soil was rich, black, almost sweet with the scent of rot and old vegetables. The rabbit hopped forward cautiously. Rain pattered harder now, flattening the grass. Drops gathered on her whiskers. She shook her head, then lowered it again, sniffing near the shed. There was something here. Something warm, faint, alive. She followed it. Inside the house, a light flickered in the kitchen. Mrs. Halpern stood by the window, watching the storm gather over her yard. She'd returned to the house only a week ago, after 5 years away. Her husband was gone now, the garden abandoned since his illness. She hadn't wanted to look at it, not really. But tonight the rain drew her toward it, the way it used to. She saw the lilac moving first, just a small shake in the wind. Then the rabbit, a small sodden shape, pale against the dark soil. It stood for a moment under the downpour, nose lifted, rain shining on its back. Then it began to dig again, not to escape this time, but to burrow deeper into the soft earth near the fence. Mrs. Halpern pressed her fingers against the glass. Something about the sight, that small, desperate work, felt like breathing after holding it too long. She turned off the light, watched the rabbit disappear into the shadow of the wall. The rain came harder, drumming against the roof, soaking the garden in sound. By morning, the world was new. The air smelled clean, the soil dark and wet. A single paw print marked the edge of the path, filled halfway with rainwater. Beside it, where the rabbit had dug, the ground had collapsed slightly, leaving a small hollow that led beneath the wall. And inside the garden, among the weeds, something green had begun to sprout. It wasn't much, just a small leaf, bright against the mud, but it was enough, the kind of small, quiet thing that starts again when no one's looking. By the next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air still carried its weight, that deep green heaviness that makes everything smell alive again. The garden was slick with water, each weed holding its own tiny mirror of the gray sky. Mrs. Halpern stood at the kitchen window, watching the light spread through the clouds. It was the first morning she'd woken without the sound of rain in months. She poured herself a cup of tea and set it on the sill, letting the steam fog the glass. From here, she could see where the lilac leaned against the wall and the darker patch of soil where the rabbit had dug the night before. The hole was still there, fresh, dark earth piled at the edge, and she was back. The rabbit moved carefully along the garden's edge, paws sinking slightly into the damp ground. Her fur was cleaner now, brushed smooth by the rain, but she still looked like winter hadn't quite let her go. Ribs faintly visible, ears too thin. Mrs. Halpern smiled without realizing. "You're early," she murmured. The rabbit sniffed the air. It smelled of worms and new grass. The human scent was faint, but not sharp. Old, quiet, softened by the rain. She didn't mind it. She hopped closer to the lilac, then began nosing through the loose soil. Something beneath the surface smelled promising. Old roots, maybe. Her paws brushed something smooth. A small bulb, half rotted, half alive. She nibbled it once, then left it. Some part of her, instinct, memory, or hunger, told her to dig nearby instead. She began to scrape at the soft earth again, shaping it into a narrow trench. The ground here was warmer, richer. She could feel the pulse of water underneath, the deep rhythm of soil that had slept too long. By mid-morning, the sun broke through. Mrs. Halpern stepped outside, her boots sinking into the mud. The air was cool but not cold. The world smelled awake. She crouched by the hole, careful not to startle the rabbit. But the animal didn't bolt. She only froze for a moment, then went back to digging, her nose twitching. "Not afraid of me, are you?" The rabbit paused, looked up, eyes dark and still. Then she went back to work. Mrs. Halpern chuckled. "Good. There's not much to be afraid of here." She reached down and pressed her hand into the soil. It was soft, black and wet and full of life. For the first time in years, she felt the shape of it, how it gave way and held at the same time. "You've got the right idea," she said softly. "This ground still remembers." The rabbit hopped backward, gave one last sniff, then darted beneath the lilac, disappearing under the wall again. That afternoon the light shifted, thin gold breaking through gray clouds. The air grew lighter, and the sound of dripping water slowed to silence. Mrs. Halpern fetched her husband's old spade from the shed. The handle was cracked, the metal dull, but it still fit her hand perfectly. She began to dig, not deep, not neat, just enough to turn the soil. Each scoop released a smell that made her chest ache. Damp earth, wet roots, the faint sweetness of rot. She didn't plan to plant anything, not yet. She just wanted to feel the ground breathe again. By evening, her back ached, and her palms were black with soil. She sat on the step, watching the first stars appear behind the thinning clouds. Somewhere beyond the wall, she heard movement, the quiet, steady shuffle of small paws in loose earth. The rabbit was back again, probably checking her tunnel, maybe building something she'd never see. Mrs. Halpern smiled. "All right," she said to the dark. "You can keep your corner. I'll keep mine." The wind moved through the lilac, brushing rain from its leaves. The smell of wet stone drifted through the garden, mixed with something green and clean. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was close. Something small, steady, and alive, pushing up through the dark. By the third morning, the garden no longer looked abandoned. It wasn't beautiful yet, not tidy or blooming, but it had changed in a way that only someone who'd been watching closely could see. The ground had begun to move. Tiny things first, the faintest green beneath the mud, a scatter of pale sprouts, the smell of rot turning into life. Mrs. Halpern stood at the edge of the path with her old spade, the same one she hadn't touched since her husband's last spring. Her hands remembered the weight of it, how to turn the soil without breaking it, how to listen for the sound of roots giving way. The rabbit had been there before her. She could tell by the tracks, small, sharp prints pressed into the soft earth beside the lilac. The tunnel beneath the wall had widened a little, and near it, a scattering of half-buried stems and unearthed bulbs. The little thief had been busy. Mrs. Halpern knelt, brushed the dirt aside with her fingers, and found a single tulip bulb the rabbit hadn't eaten, just turned over, curious. She held it in her palm, smiling faintly. "Well," she said, "at least you've got taste." She planted it again, deeper this time, and pressed the soil firm around it. The smell of rain still lingered in the air, not the sharp smell of a storm, but the damp sweetness that comes after, when the earth has time to breathe. It clung to her sleeves, to her skin. The rabbit came at noon, when the clouds broke and the sunlight fell like coins through the lilac branches. She moved with care, stopping every few feet to listen. The woman's scent was everywhere now, strong, warm, mixed with the smell of iron and soap, but not threatening. It was part of the garden's new language. The rabbit hopped toward the turned earth, sniffed the ground, and began to dig again. Not deep this time, just enough to leave her own mark, a shallow burrow beneath the shade. When she was done, she sat still for a long time, ears turning toward the wind. The sound of bees came faintly from somewhere far away. The world smelled of damp grass and the faint sweetness of lilac bloom. The rabbit blinked once slowly and settled her chin on her paws. She didn't know what this place was. Not a burrow, not wild, but it was enough. Inside, Mrs. Halpern watched from the window again. She'd started doing that without meaning to, setting her tea on the sill, standing just long enough for the glass to fog. The rabbit was there every day now. Not always at the same time, but always after the rain or before dusk. She found herself talking to it, quietly, like she used to talk to her plants. "You're stubborn," she'd say. "I'll give you that." Or, "If you're going to dig there, at least stay away from the carrots." Sometimes she laughed at herself afterward. The sound small but genuine. The garden was still mostly mud and weeds, but it no longer felt empty. She'd started turning new beds, stacking stones, clearing space for seed. The ache in her back was old and familiar, the kind of ache that reminded her she was still here. That evening, the air grew thick again, heavy with the promise of rain. The sky went soft and violet, and the lilac began to hum with bees finding their way home. Mrs. Halpern stepped outside just as the first drops fell. The rabbit was already gone for the night, her tunnel dark beneath the wall. The smell of wet earth filled the air, sweet and low. She closed her eyes and let the rain soak into her hair, her clothes, her hands. It was the same garden, the same ground. But she realized, for the first time, it was growing again. Not just the plants, the place, the silence. The part of her that had stopped waiting for anything to live here again. She knelt, pressed her palm into the soil. It was warm, and beneath the sound of rain, she could hear it, faint, rhythmic. The quiet shifting of something alive beneath the wall, digging deeper, steady, unafraid. By the fourth morning, the world had softened. The rain had passed again in the night, leaving behind air that smelled green and clean, heavy with lilac and soil. The garden shimmered with dew. Every blade of grass caught the light like glass. Even the old stones of the wall glistened, dark and new. Mrs. Halpern stepped out barefoot, holding her mug of tea in both hands. She didn't notice the cold. The rabbit's tracks were everywhere now. Tiny arcs pressed into the mud, weaving between the beds she'd started to turn. The animal had stopped hiding her work. Her tunnels had spread like veins, connecting the wall to the lilac and the patch of soil by the shed. A burrow. Mrs. Halpern smiled. "You've made yourself at home, haven't you?" She knelt beside the lilac, brushed away a few loose leaves. Beneath the roots, the earth was dark and smooth, hollowed neatly, packed and dry inside. The entrance was lined with bits of grass, shredded bark, a few of the softer stems she'd trimmed the day before. And deeper in, she saw movement. The rabbit blinked back at her from the shadow. Not afraid, just watchful. Mrs. Halpern whispered, "Good morning." The rabbit didn't move. Then, slowly, she turned her head aside, revealing, tucked against her belly, a small gray shape. Then another. Mrs. Halpern drew a breath. "Oh." She stayed there, kneeling in the mud, not daring to speak again. The light shifted as the sun rose higher. The lilac leaves trembled with wind. Petals drifted like faint snow across the ground. The rabbit stayed where she was, her body curved around her young, breathing still, alive. The world was silent except for the faint clicking of water dripping from branches. When Mrs. Halpern finally stood, she moved slowly, quietly, as though she were leaving a church. She went to the shed, found an old piece of canvas, and stretched it over the lilac to keep the rain off. Not close enough to disturb, just enough to shelter the hollow. The smell of the earth beneath the lilac changed immediately. Richer, warmer, full of that deep sweetness that only comes from living things. She sat back on her heels, watching. It wasn't joy exactly that filled her. It was something steadier. Relief, maybe. Gratitude. The garden was no longer just hers. It belonged to everything that had decided to stay. That evening, when the rain began again, she didn't go inside. The sky was low, the air soft. The sound of the drops on the lilac leaves was light, like fingers on glass. She sat on the steps of the porch, hands clasped, the smell of wet soil all around her. Through the silver curtain of rain, she could just see the lilacs sway. Beneath it, the burrow stayed dry. The small life inside it slept. And for the first time in years, Mrs. Halpern realized she wasn't waiting for anything. The garden didn't need her to fix it. It had already begun. She had only needed to see it. Later, when the rain stopped, the air smelled exactly as it had that first night the rabbit came, wet, alive, full of promise. The moonlight fell through the clouds, pale on the wall, silver on the lilac leaves. From somewhere beneath the roots came the faintest sound, a soft scrape of earth, the pulse of small breathing things, the quiet miracle of persistence. Mrs. Halpern smiled. "Sleep well," she whispered. And the garden, for the first time in years, answered her, not with words, but with life.